topic is telecounseling. Anybody have any announcements or comments or questions before we get started? Right, Alicia, you're already recording, right?
Yes.
Okay, I'll let you keep recording unless you'd rather have me record.
I went ahead and did it because it will show up on my hard drive for conversion when we're finished, and it'll just be easier for me that way to grab it.
Okay, perfect. I'll hand it over to you.
Okie dokie. So today's topic is an introduction to EMAS Telecounseling Pro. This is going to be sort of a beginner's level course. This particular presentation has been designed to address people who have not set up a telecounseling program on their campus yet. So we're not going to go directly into how to do it. We're going to start with a high-level overview and a little bit of an explanation as to how the telecounseling program gets set up and implemented, and then we'll go into practices. I'm your trainer today, Alicia Wilton. I am the Web and Learning Content Manager at EMAS Pro. And let's get to it. So our learning objectives today is, the learning objectives today are we are going to determine how to implement a telecounseling program. We're going to learn how to create call scripts. We're going to learn how to create call results. And we're going to learn how to assign telecounseling calls, how to make those calls, and then how to measure the results of those telecounseling efforts. So the objectives for implementing a telecounseling program might seem a little bit overwhelming at first, but if you take it into bite-sized chunks, it's really not too terrible. The basic gist of this is that you have a strategic portion that you can see my little label over here on the right. The strategic plans would include understanding your telecounseling contexts. So in what context would you be making calls? Determining your telecounseling goals and objectives. So what are you trying to accomplish? Determining your performance metrics, which means how are you going to measure and quantify the results of your efforts? How are you going to determine what kind of return on investment you're getting on those efforts? And then determining your telecounseling workflow, and that's going to make a little bit more sense in just a few minutes when we get into the workflow piece. And then the actions portion of this implementation would be actually implementing the telecounseling plan. So we'll get into that a little deeper in just a few minutes as well. This is a high-level overview of the communications power of EMAS Recruitment Pro. So EMAS Recruitment Pro enables you to coordinate all of your communications to help you segment, track, monitor, and build your ideal class. You can see that ideal class down here at the bottom of the funnel. The EMAS Recruitment Pro Communications Suite includes campus visits and events, email and mail campaigns, telecounseling outreach, which we're going to talk about today, and your recruiter outreach. So all of that top tier is the different channels through which you can communicate with your prospects. And then, of course, you would be segmenting your communications into these various groups. I've got examples here in the green boxes, but your groups could certainly be different. And then once you have all of those in place, obviously you want to track, report, and monitor so that you can iteratively improve your communications processes in order to reach that final goal of your ideal class. So to determine what your telecounseling goals, objectives, and expectations are, you want to ask yourself some of the following questions. For example, what are your enrollment goals related to telecounseling? What kind of numbers are you trying to reach with that telecounseling program? What kinds of relationships are you building with the callees? Who on campus do you collaborate with to relate to the callees? So interdepartmental collaboration. How frequently do you want to call each callee? And some of that depends on the size of your telecounseling team. What is your message for each callee? And that's part of the planning process that we'll go over in just a few minutes. And what types of calls will you be making? So this is referring to what we call funnel calls, which are the ones that are contained in the standard communication plans for the student. Those are based upon the entry term segment and market stage, or sorry, the entry term stage and market segment. And those calls would be ones that need to be controlled by stage changes. So things like please apply now, decision accept or deny, class registration, communications, things of that nature that are going to be triggered by stage changes should be the ones that are included in the standard comm plans, as opposed to targeted calls, which are more of a specific purpose type call. Those can be directed at one individual student or a group of students using the select target group function. Those types of calls would include things such as missing items, news, announcements, event invites, things of that nature. So those things would not be triggered by a stage change. Those would be triggered by a query criteria, for example, on a select target group or an individual student. Determining performance metrics is very important when we're talking about telecounseling or any other kind of outreach campaign. You want to know how well you're doing, both in the present as well as compared to the past. So you can see here we have a little chart that's kind of giving the example of we're looking at a report this year versus last year, and we can see improvements or degradations depending on how your program is going. So for example, if you wanted to look at the attempted calls versus successful calls in terms of year to year or this year versus prior year, you could pull up certain reports that would give you that information. We have ready to go reports in Recruitment Pro in the Crystal Reports area that are ready to go. So you don't have to design anything. It's just a click and click. Some of those other reports include ones that will display the success rate of those calls, the average talk time, which is controlled by the timer in the telecounseling tool, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. The call detail by counselor will give you information that is related to the counselor per counselor. So for example, if you want to see which counselors are making more calls versus others, or if you want to understand which ones are spending longer times on the phone, which ones are having more success with their calls versus the other counselors, you can do that with these reports. There's also reports that have to do with the communication name that are being used for the calls. So this is a way that you can compare the various types of communications that you have set up for telecounseling calls, and maybe some of those communications work better than others when you compare your reports. So that is a way that you can refine your processes to be more successful in the future. This is a high-level overview of the telecounseling workflow. You want to just 5 basic steps in the high-level overview is determining your prospects, so figuring out who it is that you want to call, planning your calls, which includes determining which communications those prospects will get, then actually making the calls. Step 3, contact your prospects. Step 4 is manage your data. I'm going to probably repeat this about 40 times during this presentation because this is the most important piece of the entire process of telecounseling, managing the data. And what I mean when I say that is, what were the results of the call? What did you get back from the student about what you were calling them about? If you're calling them about a particular topic, such as inviting them to an event, for example, did they want to come? Did they not want to come? And also, what else did you pick up while you were on that call? So for example, if you're talking about the event and somehow you get into a different discussion and the student happens to mention that they're also interested in XYZ University, you can then go into the student record and put that into the interests area so that that is recorded and it could be of use for your future marketing or telecounseling efforts. And then finally, of course, you want to assess your progress, measuring how well you are or are not doing, and being able to use that data to iteratively improve your program. So step 1 of that high-level overview is determining who are your prospects. And so we'll go ahead and dive into that. Determining your prospects includes understanding the market segment, entry term, and stage in EMAS Recruitment Pro. So as I was discussing just a little bit earlier, the types of telecounseling calls that would need to go into the standard plan would depend upon that market segment, entry term, and stage. And so you'd want to have telecounseling calls that make sense for those particular combinations of groups. Then you'd want to identify prospects using a select target group. Again, that would be for telecounseling calls that had to do with things that did not need to be triggered by stage changes, such as event invites or missing items. And then, of course, you'd want to load prospects into EMAS. This just has to do with brand new installations and people making sure they have good amounts of student records in their system. And then loading up the communication plans, which we're going to talk about right now. So loading your communication plans, I think if you guys have been users for a while, you're probably already familiar with this process, but just for a quick review, the communication plan has to do with sequential communications that will follow one another according to the amount of time that you specify between those communications. So in terms of telecounseling, perhaps call number 1 happens today. Perhaps there's an email on the same day, and perhaps there's a text on the same day. And then maybe call number 2 happens 2 weeks from call number 1, and maybe call number 3 happens 2 weeks from call number 2. So this is really dependent on how frequently you want to call the students, how many calls they actually need in terms of what you're trying to accomplish. And then, of course, it also depends on how big your team is. So if you don't have the manpower, woman power to cover 3 calls for every student for however many students you have in the group that you're trying to call, then you'd obviously want to pare this down into a manageable amount for your team in particular. If you have a big giant team, you can make this as robust as you want probably and just measure out your hours so that it covers all of your calls. And we'll talk about that later too. So step 2, planning your calls. When you're planning your calls, you want to think about naming conventions, because when we get into the calls due screen, you're going to see that it can be very possible that you have thousands of calls listed in that screen. And so, or sorry, I'm going too far here. I need to back up a second. My apologies. Naming conventions are important when you get into the name communication screen, where you have all kinds of communications set up, emails, phone calls, whatnot. It can get pretty hefty in there, and so when you're scrolling through even just the telecounseling communications, there could be quite a few of them. So it's important to try to set up a naming convention that will indicate to your users which of those communications are for what. So I'll show you examples of those when we get into the system later, but usually people tend to lean towards using a prefix of some sort. So like it'll say counselor dash and then the name of the communication. And so what that does is that it lines up all of those communications that are prefixed with the word counselor. It lines them all up into the same area in that call, in the name communication screen, so that it's easier to find them and group them. You want to also think about the types of calls that you need to be making. You know, as we were discussing just a few minutes ago, what is the purpose of the call? Are we trying to get them to come to something? Are we trying to tell them they're missing something? That sort of thing. So you want to just think about what sorts of calls you're making and who they need to go to. And then, of course, your call workflow is your big picture, as we were talking about just a few minutes ago. Your call plans are the planned communications that you will be using to make those calls. Your call scripts are the messages that your callers will actually use to make the calls themselves. So we've all had that experience where we called the phone company or we called the cable company and we got the person on the other end who had a script that they had to read to us according to what we were asking them. That's what we're talking about here. It's basically a way for you, if you are the supervisor, or you if you're the caller, to make sure that you stay on message and make sure that you say everything that needs to be said. And then the calls due are actually the assignments that get made as to who is going to make the calls or which students need to be called. The calls don't always have to be assigned to someone because it could be that you're just going to let the team loose on the call list and let them go to town. So it doesn't necessarily need to be assigned to someone, but it will be assigned to a student to be called. So here's the telecounseling workflow that I was referring to a second ago. This is an example of one call. This one call could have 4 possible outcomes when you make the call. So obviously you're going to dial first. Then one of 4 things is going to happen. The student is going to answer, no one's going to answer, someone else is going to answer, or you're going to get a wrong number or no number. So in the first possible scenario, if the student answers, they're going to be in this, I think in this particular example, this is a call about an event. So they're going to be interested in the event or they're going to be not interested. In the case that they are interested, you'll go ahead and schedule the event and then manage the data. In other words, update that student record. You're going to record the result of the call, which is that they are interested in coming to the event, and then any other information that you were able to pick up on the call during that conversation, as I was referring to before. The other scenario, if the student answers, is that they're not interested in the event, and in that case, you go straight to the Manage My Data portion, record the call result as not interested, and then put in any other information that you were able to glean from that call. In the second scenario that no one answers, you'll leave a message. There is an option in the telecounseling tool that you can schedule a callback, and what that does is that it will automatically insert another call into that student's student plan to be made at a later time, so that either you or whoever you specify will be triggered to then call them again about that topic. And then when you've done that, scheduled the callback, then you will again manage your data, update the student record. Obviously, there's nothing that you could have gleaned from the call in this case because they didn't answer, but anything else that you need to put in the record, you would do that at that time. And then the same scenario, if someone else answers, that's the same sort of line of logic there. And then if it's a wrong number, obviously you want to update that student record to indicate that is the wrong number, and maybe make a note that the team needs to figure out what the correct number is. So that's the Manage My Data piece there. This flowchart only refers to the one phone call about the event. So it is a good idea on the very front end, if you're just implementing a telecounseling program, to maybe do a flowchart like this for each one of the types of calls that you're going to be doing. And what this will do is it'll help you think through the various scenarios that could happen from that one phone call and be able to provide scripts to your callers accordingly. Step 3, contacting your prospects. This is making the calls themselves. So when you're ready to do the calling, if you're the caller on the floor, you want to ready your EMAS screens, and we'll go over that in just a few minutes. You want to look at the student record as a matter of best practice because there may be data in the student record that could be pertinent to the call that you're making. Demographic data, contact history, things of that nature. Then obviously make the call. Schedule the appointment is the next step here, and the reason why it's in brackets is because that is just one example of one of the things that you might do after the call or during the call, depending on what the purpose of the call is. In this particular example, we're calling to schedule an appointment. Maybe that's something that needs to go in the student plan, maybe it's not. Recording the outcomes of the call, that's the Manage My Data piece that we keep hammering on. And then prompting the next action for that student. It might involve assigning an additional call or an additional communication item, depending on the purpose of the first call. And then the end of the call, the follow-up actions, managing your data, making sure that record is complete before you cut the call as a best practice is recommended, and then repeat for the next student. And again, manage your data, update the student record, optionally assign an additional call or add a communication item, and then manage the calls due list with caller queries. That probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense right at this moment, but it will in just a few minutes when I show you the calls due list. So that is the high-level overview of how to implement the telecounseling program for your institution. It's a 5-step process. And then when you have it in place, you obviously want to assess your progress to see how well you're doing and make improvements where needed. So we provide, as mentioned, we provide 13 standard reports in EMAS Recruitment Pro. Those are simple point-and-click reports. You don't have to do any report designing. Some of those reports include calls due, call success by caller, call success by communication name. So you can tell which callers are doing better than others, which communications are doing better than others. Calls by result code, so you're going to see if the majority of your students are successful calls, or if the majority of your student calls are resulting in other results, then you can make adjustments from there. And then call detail by counselor, again, that would give you some comparison details about your counselors in terms of which ones of them are making more calls, which are making longer calls, which are making more successful calls, etc. And finally, you want to consider both statistical and anecdotal data. This is something that not everyone thinks about. So your statistical data is your hard data. This is the factual numbers and data that lives in the system and that you put into the system in terms of how you populate your standard fields and your user-defined fields in EMAS Recruitment Pro. So statistical data would be like birth date or call result. The anecdotal data are information or details that you get from the student while you're on the phone with them that may not be something that has already been predefined in your system. For example, if I'm talking to a student and they happen to mention that their dog's name is Fido, I can put that into the notes of their student record. And why would I do that? Because the next time a counselor calls that student and they look at the notes, they can see the dog's name is Fido, and they can ask the student, hey, how is Fido doing? And then at that point, the student feels super special because it seems like you know them. So anecdotal data just as important as statistical. So that is the high-level overview, and we're going to jump out of the PowerPoint at this point and go into Recruitment Pro. So the first thing I want to show you is how do we get the telecounseling calls into the system? That is going to be in communications and name communications. So it's the same as the setup for all of the other communications in EMAS Recruitment Pro in terms of when you're setting up a letter or an email, those types of things. You can do the same thing with telecounseling calls. So if I sort this list by type, and I'm going to go in reverse order so those later letters pop up first. You can see this TE type of communication, that is a telecounseling call. You can see that down here. So we can see, as I was mentioning earlier, that there are quite a few of those in here. And we can see now the naming conventions that this sample data is showing you, as I was describing earlier. These communications, these are all telecounseling communications, and they have all been prefixed with the word counselor. So all of the calls that would be for the counselors to make would be here in the same grouping when you have your name communication screen open. If I scroll down just a little bit further, you can see that happen again with this naming communication prefix being AIA. This sample data, I am not quite sure what that means, but it was data that was provided to us and then scrambled in order to be sample data. So whoever had the data in the first place, I'm sure that that meant something in particular. It was probably referring to a department or a person. So in order to do a new communication as a telecounseling call, you would click this add icon here. You would select telecounseling call for the type of communication and then give it some sort of a naming convention. I'll just give it training for us. Invite to campus tour. And then you save that. And now you have the communication invite to campus tour in your name communications. So that's now that those are in there and we've seen how those get set up, I'm going to exit out of here, and then I'm going to go into the standard plan. So we're going to use 2017 because of the sample data not yet being updated for this year. Excuse me while I scroll, and we're going to choose 2017 fall, freshman, and inquiry. So this is a standard plan for a fall 2017 freshman in the inquiry stage. You can see that there is a telecounseling call here and here. So just to reiterate, things that live in the standard plan will be triggered by stage changes. So as an example, if this standard plan, as we can see, has an application started telecounseling call in it. If I am a student and I belong to this group, 2017 Fall Freshman Inquiry, and I happen to move up into the applied stage before that telecounseling call happens, then my plan, my entire plan changes because my stage has changed, Therefore, I will not get that application started call because I have now moved up into the applied stage and I have a different plan. So that is why we're saying to put the telecounseling calls that need to be triggered by stage changes into the standard plan, because that will automatically change the calls the student gets based on their stage change. Telecounseling calls that are directed at a select target group in opposition to the ones that are in the standard plan, those would need to be for one-off things such as invitations to an event, or they're missing something that you need them to provide. The manual assignment on an individual student plan is the same. So I'm going to go ahead and exit out of here, and I'm going to look at an individual student plan. So we will use Miss Harris as an example. Oops. And I need to ask the attendees, please mute if you do not have a question. Okay, so here is the student record. I'm going to go ahead and open the student plan for Lorna Harris. So we can see her student plan here. She's got a couple of telecounseling calls assigned here at the bottom. If I wanted to assign a telecounseling call to Lorna and only Lorna, I could do that by clicking Add Record here, creating the communication as the telecounseling call, and then selecting which telecounseling call she needs to get, which I'm not going to do, and because I don't want to add one at this point, but just as an example, that's how you would add a new one, and then you would click Save. So that would be the way to get a telecounseling call lined up for just one student. I wanted to point out in this screen, if I can expand these columns a little bit, you can see the dates which the communications are lined up for here on the left. And then in the scheduled column, there's a little bit of clues here if you need to sort of translate what's going on in the student plan. The scheduled column will tell you how this communication got scheduled. So in this particular case, on this one right here, this is a telecounseling call. It's called acceptance call, and you're going to see it repeat itself because this is the second training I've done on this, and I had to set up a new one. But the past acceptance call was scheduled by this U SuperEMAS-C. Well, what does that mean? It means it was a user because of the U, and it means that it's scheduled as a callback, which is why it has the -C at the end. So this was an example of when the student got called and maybe they didn't answer, or maybe they were busy, and so the telecounselor then chose the option in the telecounseling tool to schedule a callback. And as I mentioned earlier, that went ahead and automatically inserted that call into the student's plan for a callback at a later time. So the -C tells you that it's a callback. Down here, you can see that these are preceded by a P, which means that that was scheduled by the student plan. So you can see the difference between something that was scheduled by a user or the student plan. Okay. I want to just come back over here really quickly because I'm going to mention this later. But since I have the record open now.
Yes, Cody. Just for clarification, I thought you couldn't add the same communication name in the student plan because it would not save it. It would not keep it because it's the exact same thing. The only time you could do that is if it had like a variable or something.
Let's get back there. Hold on. Okay, so you're talking about the acceptance call and the acceptance call?
Yes. And you were going to add another acceptance call in like that admit congrats and the admit congrats. I thought that's the way the student plan was created, was it doesn't allow the duplicates unless there's something specifically in there. Or if it's already in contact history, it doesn't go through.
Only if it's manually entered, you can add it as many times as you want to. because it's a more conscious effort, more supposedly you know what you're doing, so you know that you're adding a duplicate.
So if it's a manual entry, it's fine, but if you put it in the student plan and it's already in contact history, it does not go through.
Yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Thank you, Lauren. I appreciate that. Okay, so we're going to come back to this later, but this is a little icon that I actually just learned about within the past month or so, and I didn't even know it was there before. So it's a really cool little feature that we're going to come back to later, but basically that is a shortcut into the telecounseling screen if you're in the student record. So we'll come back to that in a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and exit out of the student record. And we're going to go to, oops, sorry about that, telecounseling and calls due. So this is the big calls due screen, and this is where we're going to see all of the calls that are coming up due. It will list calls that are in the past, because if those calls have not been made yet, you're going to have to catch up. So it's not uncommon to see calls like this one that are scheduled for dates that have already passed. Hopefully your team is staying on top of things and this doesn't happen to you, but the system will allow it if maybe, for example, the whole campus was on vacation for Christmas or something, and there were calls that were supposed to come due that time and they didn't get made, but they're still in there because they're still they're still in the queue, so they still need to be made. So this is the calls due list for everyone. Sorry there, okay. For everyone, which what I'm saying when I say that is everybody who is assigned to make a call, or if the call is not assigned to anyone, every single call will be in here. I've got a whole bunch assigned to Liz there, but you can see these ones down here in the caller column. There's nobody assigned to these calls. And again, that is perfectly fine. If you don't need to have particular people making particular calls, you can throw the entire call list out to the telecounseling team and just let them go to town.
Can you say that again?
Yes, so you can assign calls to a particular caller if you want. For example, I have these assigned to Liz. If I want to make sure that Liz is the one doing the calling, I will assign these to her to do the calling. But if I don't care who makes the call, I can just leave the caller blank. And what that'll do is it'll just leave these calls in here with no particular assigned caller. And then in that case, this would be an example of where I have a telecounseling team and I don't care who makes the calls as long as it's somebody on the team. So I just throw the entire call list out to the team and let them all handle it, you know, let them handle each call. So in this screen, we have some details that we can see here. If I expand this out a little bit, we can see that these were scheduled, who these were scheduled by here on the far right. We can see who the student is that needs to be called here in the student name column. We can see the communication name that's going to be the communication that happens when you call them. We can see the caller that's been assigned to this, if any. There is an ability to set a time to be called, which these are not set up, but you can if you want to. And then the date that the call should be happening. So let's say that I am a telecounselor, but I don't need to see everybody in the world's calls listed here. I just want to see my own. The way to do that is to use this filter or query option up here. And then you can either use a predefined query or you can create your own. Right, in this case, I have some queries set up for calls due for particular people. So in this case, I am going to choose calls due for drought. And just so you can see what that looks like, let's go into edit mode really quickly. The criteria that gets that to happen is caller drought. And the way that that works in building the query is if you go to the table called Student Communication Plan, and then choose the caller field, you can select the value for that field. And let's say in this example, it was Liz. Then choose the add field value icon to get her criteria in there. And when you say OK, that will insert the criteria into your query. I already have that criteria in my query, so I'm going to go ahead and cancel out of here. But that is how you would build that query if you needed to. So if I go ahead and run this, only Liz's calls are now listed in this screen. So you can see that number jumped way down to 391. So here's all the calls that Liz is supposed to make. If you wanted to refresh out of that filter, you can click the refresh button and you get the full list of 996 calls back. Lorna says you can assign the caller during the select target group assignment if you wanted to assign who gets to make the call.
Then your query would have to be more robust than just the larger group of students. You'd be looking in more detail as to who gets that particular assignment, probably. Or maybe one particular caller calls all the accepted students or all of the students that have deposited or something to that regard. So that would be an instance where you could assign a caller, but probably and practically you wouldn't do that. Did that make sense?
Yes. Thank you, Laura. Okay, so I'm going to change this query now to calls due for Super EMAS, which is my username when I'm playing around in here. So you can see I've got a few calls assigned to me as Super EMAS. One of them I can tell is a callback because it has the -C at the end. And I wanted to just mention, when we do the query out of that calls due screen, it's important to mention that when you do that query, you are not querying the entire database. You are only querying the calls due. So if I did that same query, well, I guess that wouldn't be a good example. If I did a different query in the student search area, I would be querying the entire database and I would probably get thousands of records depending on what I queried for. If I took that same query and I came over here into the telecounseling tool and I did it again, I would probably get a lot less results because the results are only being pulled from this pool of calls due versus the entire database. So just something to keep in mind when you're thinking about querying in the calls due screen. A couple of things to note when you're in this screen as a caller. You can sort by date by clicking on the column title. What that'll do is it will order your calls in the order of the date that they were supposed to go out. So for example, if I'm behind as a caller, I can make those oldest due first. The calls that were due longer ago versus a shorter time ago, I can make those longer ago due calls first and then work my way up to the present. Another way to do it would be to sort by communication name by clicking on that column header. And the reason I might do that is because maybe I'm making two of the same calls, two different students, but same script. So instead of jumping around between scripts, I can actually perform that script twice in a row, back to back, and not have to skip around and come back to it later. So that would be a reason to sort by communication name. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to refresh that list one more time to get the entire thing back. And then I'm going to retrieve a call due by the name of the student. So let's say that I'm the caller and I know that I need to call Jonathan Childress. So let's go ahead and open up a call just like if we were going to make the call. This is your call screen. Sorry, I'm scrolling my notes. Just a second. Okay. This is your call screen. There are a couple of things that you might want to do to get set up when before you make the call. So for example, back here you can see my student record is still open. That's important because as the caller, I might want to refer to some of this data before I talk to this person. Depending on what your purpose of the call is, there might be information here in the student record that is pertinent to what you're going to talk to them about. The other couple of things that you might want to look at before making the call, the student contact history, so that you can see what the student has received thus far before you ever call them. In this case, you can tell that they've had 2 calls, there's been a letter, there's been an email, a couple more letters, etc. If your call is about a particular topic that depends on something that has happened in the past, this is a good way to look and see, you know, did the student get the invite to the event that I'm going to talk about, or, you know, what have you. So contact history would be one thing to look at. The other thing you might want to look at before calling them would be the student plan. And the reason for that is sort of that you're looking backwards and forwards, right? So you have the contact history to look backwards, what have they already received? And the student plan to look forwards, what are they going to receive after I call them about this? So you have a big picture, a whole understanding of the student before you make the call. Now let's say that I'm the telecounselor and I come in here every Wednesday and I make telephone calls for this institution. If I want the screens to pop up exactly like this for me every single time I make a call, instead of doing all of the things that I just did to get those screens on the screen, the way to do that would be to come over here and click the Save Desktop icon. And what that does is it keeps all of these screens just like I have them right now, so that each time I open that call that is due for myself to call the student, I get all of these other helper screens popped up automatically for me. And that way I can do my overview very quickly before I call the student and then make my phone call. All right, so the other thing that needs to be covered here is this timer. The timer down here is going to control what kind of data you get back out of your reports. What I mean when I say that is, if I'm a caller, if I'm a telecounselor, and I open this call screen in order to make a call, this time is indicating the time that I started this call. So this is not, you're not going to see it running, but that is the time that you started. So me being in Central Time, you can see from this time I started at 2:55. If you look down here at my computer clock, it is now 2:58. That means I've been on this call for 3 minutes. When I say on this call, what I'm saying is that I've been working on this call, not that I've been talking on this call. So it is recommended best practice that you let the timer start. In other words, open your call screen just like this, let that timer begin, and then do your research, look at the student record, look at the contact history, look at the student plan, get the information that you need prior to making the call, and then make your call, have your conversation, record your call result, make any notes in the student record that you need to make, including anecdotal data, and then cut the call. When you cut the call using this scissors icon here, that's going to stop the timer. And the reason why we're recommending that you do all that stuff while on the timer is that when your reports come out and it talks about in the report how much time did the counselor spend on each call, if you don't include your preparatory and conclusionary, is that a word? Conclusive? Your concluding steps, if you don't include the primary and conclusion steps in that timer, then it's not going to be an accurate number as to how long you actually spent working on that particular call. So if you want your reports to be accurate in terms of how long was the entire thing from front to back, meaning from the time you needed to do your research here in the student record, all the way up to the time when you have everything updated and are ready to close the student record, that should be the accurate number of the time that it takes to do this particular call. Okay, so let's pretend like I've made my call. This is where we, when I was touching on the scripts earlier, this is where you'd find your script. So this icon right here. Actually, let me back up a second because I think I neglected to show you some shortcuts here. My apologies. Just going to close those really quick because these icons right here in the call screen can be used to open the windows that I used the menu to open. That was my bad. I meant to use the icons and I used the window instead. So my apologies for that. This icon here will open up the history. This icon here will open up the plan. So you don't actually have to go to the menu tree to do the things that I just did. You can use the icons right here in the call screen. Okay, with that being said, let's pretend that I'm getting ready to make my call as a telecounselor. I'm going to click the call script icon, and this is going to tell me what I'm supposed to say. So in this particular case, you're going to see Valparaiso mentioned in the script, and that is probably because Valpo is one of the providers of this sample data. So just ignore that, or pretend that I'm at Valpo. And so if I'm making this call and I am the telecounselor, I'm going to read this off to the student. There's going to be probably a response from the student because it looks like we're going to be asking them if they're interested in visiting campus. And so once I have the once I have the script read and I've got my results, I've got my call response, I can go ahead and close out of that. And then at that point, I'm going to choose a call result. So what happened as a result of this call? Did I call? Do I need to schedule a callback? And so those are the first two options listed here. Or sorry, the first three options listed here are callback options. And we have it set up in this database that there could be three reasons to call somebody back. They could be because you spoke with somebody else, because you spoke with the parent, or you actually spoke to the student, but you still have to call them back for some reason. Maybe they were just on their way out the door or something. So when you select one of these callback options, it's going to give you the ability to give you a rescheduled date. And that's where you see in the student plans where I was pointing out where it had the -C behind it and it was a callback. That's how that happens. So if I'm the telecounselor and I need to schedule one of those, that's the way to do it. In this particular example, I'm going to say that I called the student and I invited them to this event. And let's say they're no longer interested. Now, just as an item of note, those call results that you just saw, those are the call results that have been set up for this particular instance of EMAS Recruitment Pro. You can customize those results according to how you want your callers to record the results of their calls. So, for example, I have left voicemail message. That could be one of your options. It could be that you want to have additional options or to change that option. And if that's the case, you can do that in the validation tables. So whenever you're finished with your call, you're going to go ahead and cut the call. And it'll ask you if you wish to end the current call, and you can say yes. So now that call has been ended, and the student contact history is going to show the call having been made. You can see that right up here. Okay, so I want to now go back to the little cute little telephone that I was showing you just a few minutes ago. This guy. Let's pretend like you're a counselor and you are at work and a student calls you. So you are not a telecounselor, you're an advisor or a recruiter or somebody of that nature, and you're sitting at your desk and one of your students calls you. And you notice that they have a telecounseling call that's coming due in their student plan. You can just click this guy right here and it goes straight into that call screen. So the purpose of this is, as I said, if I'm an advisor and my student calls me and I see that they have a telecounseling call coming up, instead of waiting for my telecounselor to make that call, I can just go ahead and say, hey, I'm just going to go ahead and do this call script right now. So if I click that little telephone icon, I'm going to get into this call screen immediately without having to go all the way back through the menu and get into telecounseling and calls due. So that's a good little shortcut to have if you wanted to complete a telecounseling call on the fly. Now, there is one more. I want to go back to calls due just really quickly because there is one more option that I need to show you with regards to call scripts. Hang on just one second, sorry. Okay, so this one right here. This is called acceptance call, and if I click the script for this one, you're going to see a little bit of a difference between what we were seeing before and what we're seeing now. This script has been set up as an open-ended question as the beginning And please ignore my Mary Had a Little Lamb. That was from a previous training. Sorry about that. Forgot to clear it out. But the main question of this was, now that we've accepted you, do you plan to attend? So that can be a yes or no question. And depending upon the response that you get from the student that you're calling, there could be one of two possible scripts. So if they say yes, then you click the yes button, and there is your script for the yes answer. And using the back button down here at the bottom, if in the opposite example they say no, you can click the no button down here, and you have a totally separate script for that no answer. So that's a good way to set up some logic-based scripts. Okay, I think that concludes the calling portion of this, and I'm going to go ahead and close that without saving. So I wanted to show you how you do the scripts. So the way that's done, it's not obeying me. I'll see if I can get there anyway. So you go to Telecounseling and the Scripts Editor. And this is the script that we were just looking at with the yes or no answer. So if, for example, I wanted to change this script, I could click the edit icon here. And that's where I could have and should have cleared out Mary Had a Little Lamb. So let's just say I did something important right there, which I did not. And I will go ahead and save this record. So now that script is saved. And then likewise, if I wanted to edit the yes answer, I could click that yes button at the bottom, click the edit button, and then I could change the script for the student response of yes. Same thing for the no answer. If we go back, we're still in the acceptance call script, but if we click no, and we want to change the no response, we can do that by clicking the edit icon, and then we can change that the script for the no response. So that's how you would set up your scripts if you were the supervisor. And I'm going to go ahead and exit, or sorry, one more thing before we exit, getting ahead of myself as usual. This is where you can pull down. The drop-down menu will let you choose different scripts, so different communication names that you have set up. You can change the script for each and every one of them if you wanted to, or you could add a new script. And so it's going to ask you, where does this script get tied to? So which communication should the script belong to when you make that particular call? You can choose college fair follow-up, for example, and give that one a script. And that way, every time that call gets made, this particular script will get used. All right, so I'm going to exit out of here. And very, very quickly, I want to show you the reports. And then if we have time after that, I will show you how to change the default number of weeks that the calls do screen shows. So if I open that really quickly, see up here where it's at 320 of 18 to 515 of 18. That is a setting of, I believe, 8 weeks. You can change that 8 weeks to whatever you want in system parameters. So if we have time, I'll show you how to do that. If not, just get at me afterwards and I'll send you the instructions. But I really wanted to go through just a couple of these reports very quickly so that you can see the measurement piece of the telecounseling operation. So if we come in here to the select reports and we say we want, oh, sorry, my bad, the category, scroll down to Crystal Telecounseling. That will give us a list of the telecounseling reports that are available to us. The call detail by counselor report is the one I'm going to show you just quickly here as an example. And I'm going to select all students, but you could further filter this report using a query with this drop down here. It's also important to note that you have a date range. So if you don't have details for calls made between these dates, you're not going to get anything back in the report. Just because I know that this database is a little skimpy when it comes to 2018, I'm going to go back up a little bit so we can see some stuff. And then I'm going to go ahead and say preview. And now we have a report that shows us call detail by counselor. So you can see that this particular counselor, SED, it looks like they're the ones making the most amount of phone calls. If we scroll down here, you can see that these are segmented by counselor. So this was JLA's calls. It looks like there was only one of them. And the result of that call is that they're no longer interested. You can see for the counselor or advisor, whoever this is, telecounselor, RMT, it looks like they had 2 calls. One of them got rescheduled and one of them was no longer interested. And then we get to SED, who had, oh, sorry. Looks like they had two. That's what I'm doing wrong.
Alicia?
Okay.
Alicia?
They had 4, yes.
Just a quick clarification. The call detail by counselor is not by caller. I mean, it shows who the caller is, but the graph is showing basically by territory. So the counselor is not the person who made the call. The calls were made in the counselor's territory.
Oh, okay. I did not know that.
So
Okay.
SED, RMT, and JLA are counselors, but they're not necessarily the caller.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay. Okay, I did not have that understanding. Thank you. Gotcha. Okay, perfect. Okay, so that's just an example of one report, and it looks like we are getting really close to time here, so I'll let you explore the rest of those reports on your own, but those do include some of the details I was showing you in that metric slide at the beginning of the session. And the last thing I want to point out here is under the Learn, Recruitment Pro Learning, Communicate option. This is where you're going to find your telecounseling resources. Under this telecounseling area right here, we have some videos for you to watch. We have a workbook for telecounselors. We have a supervisor guide for supervisors. And then there's a couple of other videos about creating call scripts and call results, as I was briefly showing you just a little bit ago. All right, so it looks like we have about 2 minutes left because I'm verbose. Sorry, guys. Who has questions? Anybody? Bueller?
No questions here.
All right, very good. So that is a broad overview of telecounseling as in a nutshell within an hour space of time. So thanks guys for hanging with me during my fumbles here, and I appreciate everybody being here and everybody's attentiveness.
Just a quick comment for all of you on the call. You're going to be receiving a survey evaluation. If you could fill that out, and then that's how we provide feedback. And we will be meeting again in 2 weeks. And I'm trying to remember who's on the schedule for 2 weeks from now. But it's one of the EMAS staff members. And so we'll be doing this again in a couple of weeks. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Bye now.
Appreciate
Bye.
it.
Great job, Alicia.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.